Kamen Rider Zero.
Hey YouTube, Dawson Rider here, and welcome to my series review for Kamen Rider Zero-One. I think I can sum up my overall thoughts on the series in one sentence. Don't lecture me, you can opener. Alright, until next time, don't forget, just kidding. I'll give more overall thoughts, but that does kind of just sum up the core. If you follow me on Twitter, that sums up my core feelings on the series. But I actually wanted to start by talking about something, a little bit unique talking point to start on, just because I feel like as I get into the plot, I'm going to forget it. But I thought it was worth noting that this was the first series in the Reiwa Era. You had Geo, and then you had the end of the Heisei Era, and so this was the first of the Reiwa Era. And now that it's complete, I wanted to talk about, was it different? No, I don't think it was. I think it was 99.999999999% the same. It was basically just like a Heisei Era series. You know, there wasn't really any huge differences. It used most of the same structures and the same tropes and the same everything. I really didn't feel there was anything different storytelling wise about it, or any attempts to be that different in a new era. The only thing different that I did notice was I felt we went a little bit more back to basics in a manner of speaking to the suits. You know, obviously Zero-One's core suit, you know, was more traditional Rider-esque, sort of similar to how Doubles was after Decade, and you know, obviously Kuga's was before we started getting weird, but it just made sense, so I'm pretty sure that was intentional to sort of get to, like, Zero-One looked a little bit classic, but a little bit new at the same time. But I think in general, the suits went back to basics. They were a little bit more sleeker, a little bit more normal. They were kind of this mix of kind of simple and interesting. Not all of them were great. There were definitely some weird ones, like that Hirobi upgrade suit from the end arc. I didn't think looked good. It looked like a kid's drawing come to life, or like the abstract thought in the Pixar movie. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Inside Out. It was like abstract thought version of Hirobi. So they didn't all land, but I appreciated them kind of going back to these more simple, cool, basic looking suits, because we just started to get really weird in the Heisei Era near the end, where like they kept looking like outgrown fungus. So I like that most of them were normal, even right down to the belts. Like, it's kind of comedic how in recent years the belts have gotten more and more attachments to where it looks ridiculous. And there were some that stuck out, like I think Assault Wolves or whatever had that giant bullet thing, but for the most part I feel like they flowed together better. That was something I appreciated about the series, and I'm kind of just segueing into that a little bit, that I overall liked the designs. Not all of them were my favorite, but I thought there were some really, really good designs in this series that I liked a lot, and I just wanted to tie that into the fact that that was the only thing I really noticed, was that I felt that they dialed it back and went for a more basic approach with the suits. I'm pretty sure that Zero-One's being more of a classic suit was intentional, but I'm not sure how intentional that thought was to make the suits a little bit more simple going into the Reiwa Era, but that was legit the only thing I noticed that was different from the last few seasons. Everything else was the same as a Heisei series. Now let's talk about the series itself. The storyline was honestly primarily a classic storyline about AI becoming self-aware. And that really didn't interest me that much, because I've seen it done 1,000 times before and 1,000 times better. So this was just like the 1,000th attempt Z-list version of it. Get it? Z-list? Because Zero-One. It ended up being what the series was mostly about. And so I was just kind of over it, because I've seen it before, I know what the Terminators do, I know what needs to be done. But I did start strong with the series. I thought the series was really good at the beginning. I really enjoyed the beginning. I liked the series style, I liked the designs. I mentioned how it kind of reminded me of the vibe of Reigns' world. I just loved the overall vibe of it. I liked the energy. I thought the original Metsubo Jinrai Net arc was pretty good. It had good momentum. I felt there was an evolving mystery with evolving answers and evolving questions. And I've talked numerous times on this channel about how one of my favorite things about Rider is the sort of more serialized story and the mysteries that can happen, and they did a really good job at that. And I had fallen out of the series for just a little bit. I took a little break that had nothing really to do with the show. I just kind of fell behind. And when I came back, I finished the Metsubo Jinrai arc. I think it was like 4 or 5 episodes or something like that. And it was really good. I'm like, oh man, I really missed the show. It was really good. I liked it. And then we went into the next arc, which was the Xayah arc. And this is where the show kind of went downhill for me. And to be positive about it, I liked the idea of a competing company and him competing against Thouser. I loved Thouser's suit. I liked a lot about the concepts. And I also like the idea that they sort of infused the main plot with the filler structure, because the main structure of that arc was like an episode or 2 episode arcs about human versus human gear in these competitions, which was a classic filler setup, but it was a part of the DNA of the overall plot. And even though I didn't ultimately end up enjoying that arc very much, I liked that idea of making your filler structure a part of the main plot so that you feel like you're progressing every episode. But I wasn't really a fan of that arc, because you kind of start off strong with Thouser in this competition, and then it becomes this almost like comedic episode of the week stuff, and I didn't like the whole series. Beginning message was like, oh, human gears can have dreams and all this stuff, but then this arc was like, hey, let me show you, human, that this robot is better than you at what you like to do. That this artificial being is better than you. And I know a lot of the message ended up being like, oh, it inspired me to remember what I loved and the human gear could see in it, but I didn't like this one. I feel like the whole series would be more successful if human gears were actual beings, like some sort of aliens or something. Because it's funny, because a lot of the series does bring up some real life issues, but it's like different when they're robots, because there's so many stories about robots being evil. And then it also brought up for me another real life scenario of, you know, like I said, this brings up lots of real life parallels, but this arc here, for me, brought up this arc, get it? Up the real life scenario, the fact that there's lots of people that will lose their jobs because like an automated machine will take it. And this one was like wanting you to root for the machine, like, let's put this guy out of work with this replaceable robot that can just be repaired endlessly and take his job. I'm like, no, I'm rooting for the human, like, not this can opener. So I didn't like that arc for either the message or the execution. And then they ended up tying Thouser to being partly responsible for Arc. And I didn't really like that, because I kind of liked the idea of having multiple things going on. Like, you have Arc, and then you have this rivalry with Thouser and the different company. And I also ultimately didn't like the resolution of that, where you had Aruto kind of in this smaller company. Like, I'll admit that that had some interesting potential of him kind of being more of a rogue element starting this small company. But then, honestly, for me, it felt like it wound up just being the same as the first arcs, where it was just Aruto going around and proving human gears' worth. The only difference being he was in a smaller studio, and the human gears were kind of on the outs. But there's different circumstances, but to me it didn't feel that different. And like, ultimately, after the resolution of the Xayah arc being that he gets ousted as CEO and has to start his own little company, it kind of just had me wishing that they would have just kept a competition going. Not the competition where they had a human fight a robot in real estate battles every week, but I liked the idea of the two companies fighting. I think that would have been more interesting if they had gone about it in a more interesting way. And speaking of Thouser, after his initial arc, which I didn't necessarily love him right out the gate, but I thought he represented an interesting antagonist, but after the initial handful, this dude basically just showed up to get his butt kicked every episode. He would just show up, deliver the same monologue, and get his butt kicked, until they randomly decided to give him a backstory, which I didn't hate. It definitely ties into another problem I have, which is writers need to make most, not saying all, but most writers that are an antagonist or an anti-hero just line up with the main hero. That's something I'll get into a little bit near the end in some final wrap-up thoughts, but I didn't like that we had to make another character who was more clearly an antagonist all of a sudden be on their side. But I think that they all of a sudden just gave him backstory too quickly. I really wish that they could have spent some of that time of him just getting his butt kicked over and over again. I wish they would have spent some of that time maybe foreshadowing or setting up his story, and then you finally get to the reveal, because I think he had potential as a character. But it just felt like he was just there as a punching bag until all of a sudden they gave him backstory, and then he was just kind of part of the team. And so I think that was kind of a waste. And then once you get into the Prime arc storyline, it just, like, again, it felt like it's been done before. In so many things, I wasn't all that interested. I've said before the show could be entertaining, like the action sequences are good, and they had some little minor twists and stuff like that. And it could be entertaining to watch at times, but I wasn't that invested in it because I had seen it all before. And, you know, specifically to use a Toku example, when we got to the Arc storyline, the Arc, that reminded me a lot of one of Drive's last arcs, once Gold Drive showed up, where the Roy-Mutes who had been loyal realized they were being used by this guy. And that's kind of what this arc was about, or a part of it, was... I keep seeing the words ARK in my head when I say ARC, even though I mean ARC. Anyway, they realize they're being used by him, and they're all being manipulated, and they end up standing against him. And so that felt very similar. And I'm gonna be honest, I liked Drive's version better. For me, it actually gave me more sympathy for the synthetic beings because it kind of snuck up on me. I feel like Zero-One spent so much time beating me over the head with "your Alexa has dreams" that I was tired of it, and it felt almost like they were focusing more on these fake robots than the actual protecting people, like the real people. And they beat it over my head so much, and it felt like after the Metsubo Jinrai arc, there was very little story beyond that. And with Drive, not only did Drive have more going on, but I felt the story where I had sympathy for the Roimudes more kind of snuck up on me at the end. And it wasn't so, like, over your head, or not like, nothing goes over my head. My reflexes are too fast. I would catch it. They didn't beat you over the head with it. It was more subtle. It snuck up on me, and it was a little... I just liked it better. I thought it was better because it wasn't so over the top, and Drive had more going on in the series than just that was both separate and tied together. It ultimately evolves into this core conflict with Aruto and Hirobi, which represents... I mean, there was some stuff about the fathers and the sons and stuff like that because of Hirobi and Jin's relationship, which tied into Aruto's initial origins of his motivations because he was raised by a human gear dad, which was some kind of neat stuff there. But like the core motivation of everything was like human malice created Arc, humans are the worst, humans always have malice. And I've said this before, and when I've said it, people have tried to correct me about it. I'm not saying this is every Toku villain's motivation ever, but this is a motivation that comes up way too often in Toku, of the villain just preaching about how terrible humans are. And I'm really tired of that. So it was kind of a combination of I'm tired of hearing a Toku character preach about how terrible humanity is, and I've seen a billion robot stories before. So it was kind of those two things put together. And then it's always... I always hate that in any robot story when the robots are like, man, humans are so awful, we're gonna prove we're better than them by doing something far worse. I wasn't a fan of the human gears being like, oh, humans don't deserve this planet because of your malice, so we're gonna prove we're better than you by committing genocide. I've seen it, been there, done that, and so I wasn't really invested in that final arc. And I think that's ultimately my main problem with the story, was I really enjoyed the series at the beginning, because even though there was a lot of obvious setups for this type of generic robot storytelling, there was a good momentum of like mystery and evolving story. And I felt like once the Metsubo Jinrai Net arc ended, there was very little mystery. Like every now and then you get little stuff like when Fuwa was having the stuff going on in his head, and there was a couple little twists in the arc storyline of stuff you weren't expecting. But I never felt there was really any ongoing storylines I was invested in and thinking about the way I was at the beginning. I felt like the lion's share of the story was just about trying to tell me that these robots have dreams. And so there was very little investment for me because it was all very generic outside of a few little things. And I think that was ultimately my problem with the story. Now, just to rapid fire on the characters, to talk about Aruto, even though I don't agree with his core philosophy, I liked him more than I thought I would. I'm often annoyed by those like sort of annoying Toku characters that just shout nonsense at you. And he certainly was that. But I often found his jokes and stuff to be a little more endearing than I thought. I thought his chemistry with Izu's actress was nice, and it was very pleasant to watch and fun at times, and I liked that. And I thought he was a lot more balanced than some of them are. And then you have Fuwa, which I liked as well. I thought he was, you know, a cool character. Kind of that classic secondary writer where he's kind of stern and he's like against the main writer's motivation, but then eventually he comes around and then he has like comedic moments that go off of his sternness. The problem with him wasn't really about his character, because I mostly liked his character. It was with the way they handled one aspect of his story, which ties way back to the beginning setup of you have Aruto pro-human gears and him anti, because he thought that he was attacked and his city and his family was attacked by these robots. And that was the core motivation. And then you had Valkyrie in the middle, which I'll get to in a second. And you could see the writing on the wall that eventually he would come around to it. And there's definitely a core problem with me, is that I feel like there's nothing interesting about all the characters just aligning behind one person. I think that there's an interesting room for a debate and seeing different perspectives. And I feel like the whole thing of the series with Aruto is the only right way. And I think that Fuwa was reasonable to be afraid of these things. I think all the humans were. If Aruto was like, why are you so afraid of human gears? I'm like, I don't know. Maybe because they could get hacked and turn into a mantis monster and kill you? It's like when those Samsung phones were exploding. Imagine being like, well, this phone might explode in my pocket, but this youth told me that it has dreams. So that was a side tangent. Anyway, later in the series, when Fuwa has something going on in his head and you find out he had that Metsubo Jinrai Net guy in there helping control him, they ended up finding out that he was never attacked by human gears, and it was just put there so that he would hate human gears. And I hated this. Because the thing is, I didn't like that they absolved the human gears of this thing, because it was needless. It's not the whole series, human gears are getting hacked left and right attacking people. So it's not as if you know, the idea that Arc mass hacked all these guys to attack him would be out of the question. And, you know, either way this story would have been generic, but I think the whole thing was, I think when he was being controlled by Xayah, that would have gained him an understanding that when these human gears are hacked, it's not out of their programming. You know, that's not their fault. It's not what their main programming is. They're being hacked to do something different. And I think he would have understood that if he'd be like, oh wow, now I understand when those human gears attacked all those years ago, that wasn't what they were trying to do. They were being controlled, just like I'm being controlled now. Would that have been generic? Sure, but it would have been the perfect way for the evolution. And I felt like making that thing about the human gears not actually doing it and it being a false memory was overkill. And that really bothered me because I think it could have added more nuance to it, and the fact that he actually could have been victimized by human gears. And I wish that with that, there could have been this middle ground between Aruto kind of understood why people might have been fearful of them. And I think there would be some really interesting stuff for character stuff and conversation rather than it just being like, no, it's Aruto's way or the highway. And you have Valkyrie, who was my favorite at the beginning. She was kind of the middle of the road. She had Aruto being like, human gears for life, 2020, fitness year, 20 forever. And then Fu was like, death to human gears. And she's like, no, they're just meant to order your toothpaste when you're out. And I'm like, yeah, she's got it right. I liked her at the beginning. She was cool, she was pragmatic. It was kind of interesting that she was working for someone, which you found out was Xayah. But then after that, she had some good moments, but I felt she was mostly sidelined. Like, she spent so long under Xayah's control, and then them saying, you know, come back, you know, you don't have to do this, and they spent so long on it. I wish she would have gotten a cool different rider form. Like, she ended up getting the cool B form, but I wished that either when she was working with Xayah or when she finally turned back that she would have gotten another form. They could have even done a cheapo one where it was a recolor. That's another side tangent, but I was kind of disappointed in that. And it was finally nice to see her get back to herself and get her own motivations, and I liked when she worked with Jin. But for the most part, she felt sidelined, and I think she was a lot of wasted potential in general. It was certainly kind of cool to see a female writer in the core of the cast, because usually you will have females in the core cast, but more often than not, they're not writers, or they're like Tsukiyomi, who becomes one at the very end. But I thought it was cool to see a female writer as part of the main cast. I only say that because like she got so sidelined. So I'm hoping in the future that if we have female writers in the main lineup, that they get a little bit more to do. And then you have Jin and Hirobi, who I made jokes at the beginning would probably end up be turning good by the end, and that sort of happened. It didn't happen in the way I thought, and they were always going back and forth and you weren't sure which one was going to join the alliance, but they kind of both ended up not being full-on villains by the end. I did like the parallels of the father-son relationship based on Aruto's father-son relationship with his, and I liked that there was that understanding because of that. I thought that was kind of neat. I already talked about Thouser, how I thought he was wasted, although he did bring the best thing to this show, which was the Robo-Dogs. And like I said, I liked Izu's chemistry with Aruto. I thought that was some charming aspects of the series. You know, Arc, I don't have a lot to say. He's basically just the classic Skynet villain for the series, so I don't have a whole lot that I want to talk about with him. I guess just to sum it up, this was overall just an okay show for me. It started really strong, I liked a lot about it, but then like it just wasn't that good for me. Like I said, I've seen so much of it done before. I didn't like the one-noteness of the message. I thought there was a lot of missed opportunities for interesting debate about this and different character perspectives. I kind of miss when you had those characters, like Fuo would have been the perfect opportunity for kind of a generic Toku stereotype, but I miss having characters where they were also heroes, but they had a little bit different way of looking at things, and not all of it was necessarily wrong, and there was kind of a begrudging respect, or not even begrudging, but just kind of a respect and honor between the two characters, and they could kind of ally themselves and respect each other, but still have different points of views. And I feel like in most cases nowadays, it's always like, nope, main writer's way of thinking is the only way, and everyone's gonna fall in line behind him. And I think that's kind of boring. You know, I kind of miss having a little bit of conflict there, and different perspectives, and I think that was one of the things that bothered me about the series, beyond the generic robot storyline as well. And I think anytime there was an opportunity for a different point of view or a different style, it ultimately didn't end up happening. Like when we got to this final arc where it was Hirobi versus Aruto, I couldn't help but be reminded in a way, very different circumstances, but of Baron and Gaim at the end of Gaim. And even though I love Gaim, but Baron's motivations all of a sudden went right there at the end arc. That's for another video. But for the most part, what I liked about their dynamic was that very often they were on different pages in terms of their approach, but there ended up being this respect between them right up until the end. And, you know, every now and then they would align. And I missed relationships like that, where you can have them ally and be on the same page, but still be different and respect each other's different views. And, you know, this was obviously kind of a different case with Hirobi and Aruto, because they were on very different pages, and it was a little bit like that in a way. But I was kind of more relating that to dynamics like Fua and stuff of that nature, and I just kind of missed that. So I think that was my core problem, was it was a generic robot story, and I think there was a lot of missed opportunities for interesting character debates and character differences, and lots of wasted opportunities with characters in general. So overall, an okay series for me. I would give it a 7. We'll have to, it'll be interesting to see, sort of, I guess, what the ending movie might do, a final wrap-up for this, or a final wrap-up after the next 5D cinemas with more forms and stuff. But what did you guys think of the Zero-One series, of the first series in the Reiwa era? I'm curious to know. I'm also curious to know if you actually thought maybe it did feel more distinct as the first one of the Reiwa era outside of the Heisei era. Like I said at the beginning, for me it didn't really feel like that, but I'm curious if any of you felt that. But let me know in the comments. As always, until next time, like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps, and ring that bell. Notifications for my videos. Dawson Rider, signing out.